Thank you, Eric. Welcome to everyone all over the world. This is the AgMIP side event at the UN Food Systems Summit. I'm going to now share my screen. I'm one of the executive committee members of AgMIP, and we're now going to explain what AgMIP is and share insights from a project that AgMIP has been organizing, leading, or the network has been doing in sub-Saharan Africa. I'm going to share screen and start the presentation. There we go. Can you see it?
Yes, that's good.
Good, terrific. First of all, AgMIP stands for the Agricultural Model Intercomparison and Improvement Project. And our topic of our side event is engaging stakeholders for adaptation and food security, contributions by the AgMIP A teams. And I'll be explaining what the A teams are in a few moments. This is the side event we're very proud because it's all women presenters, but we acknowledge all the contributions to the 18 projects from our colleagues of all genders. And again, we're very pleased to be part of the Science Days for the UN Food Systems Summit. What is AgMIP? AgMIP is a network. It's a network of about 1,000 agricultural modelers worldwide. The mission of AgMIP is to provide science-based agricultural assessments of climate change to enhance sustainable farming systems. And AgMIP has been around for more than 10 years. And we've been doing these kinds of assessments now for almost that whole period. And we're eager to share the learning that that has really grown from this network approach and team approach. And we're going to give you some examples from 3 countries in sub-Saharan Africa today. However, just to let you know, AgMIP works in all over the world. And this map with many different colored triangles, circles, and stars shows the AgMIP research sites. This is actually only some of them. We need to update this for up to the minute. There is even more places, but you can see that AgMIP truly is a worldwide network, bringing together not only modelers but experimentalists and experimental data from all over the world to conduct these integrated assessments to provide rigorous evidence base for policymakers and decision making around, in particular, adaptation to climate change. So today we're going to be sharing the insights and learning from the Idrc Climate and Resilience Project. That's the overall program called CLARE. And within that program, we have a project, AgMIP has a project called the A-Team Project. And the A-Team stands for AgMIP Adaptation Teams. And we're going to hear from the project, the A-Team leaders in Zimbabwe, Ghana, and Senegal today. The circle on this slide explains the framework under the main framework that AgMIP works with for integrated assessments. So the first is starting around the circle with the orange. The first is that everything that AgMIP does is done with stakeholder engagement and outreach. And in this case, you're going to be hearing about processes that engage both national and regional stakeholders around adaptation to climate change. What are some of the tools that AgMIP uses, that the A teams have been using? And you're going to hear about these in more detail. But the A team conducts interviews and baseline and follow-up surveys. They look at data archives in relation to from stakeholders, and develop RAPs, which stands for Representative Agricultural Pathways. This is an exercise that AgMIP teams, the A teams, engage with regional and national stakeholders to create visions of agricultural development in the regions and countries under the focus, under study. So that's the orange part. You're going to be hearing, you'll hear a little bit more about the stakeholder engagement momentarily. The second main part of the framing is with regional and national data and models. So AgMIP is a network of researchers, and we use crop models, livestock models, we use farming system models, biophysical models. We bring in the climate data, both current and future, and the economics, both at the regional scales and the national scales. And look at the land surface, land cover, land use as well, through the use of remote sensing. Our third main part of the framing is a tool that we've been creating. It represents really the general challenge of how do you then scale up to scale up the communication of the learning and insights from the 18 projects. So we work with a great group of software developers in Wageningen in the Netherlands to create the AgMIP Impacts Explorer. And we're always remember the I of in the name of AgMIP. We're always working to improve our communication tools as well. Now, to delve in, I have one slide on each one of these areas: stakeholder engagement, regional and national data and models, and the Impacts Explorer. So we'll dive in a little bit more deeply. So this is an example of what we call the iterative stakeholder engagement. And we now are using this approach to coordinate national and regional scales, because what we've learned from the stakeholder engagement is that we need both in a country. We need to link what's happening in the within country regions and the farming systems there, and developing interventions for within country. But at the same time, we need to coordinate with the national policymakers to create the policies and programs that are going to implement and support the regional interventions. So this includes the visions for agricultural development. That's the RAPs that I was just describing. Deciding adaptation policies at the national level, and then implementing interventions at the regional level. We call this diagram the spiral diagram, and it shows that we don't just meet with stakeholders and say, check, we've met with stakeholders. That doesn't work. Really, it's relationship building with the stakeholders and sharing the data and models that we have developed, getting feedback from the stakeholders to inform the next iteration of the data gathering, creation, and models and simulations. Then we take the results, and then we get more feedback, and we continue that spiral of work on the data and models and interaction with the stakeholders, all the way through to outcomes that are more evidence-based and have more stakeholder engagement behind them, so that they have potential for more effectiveness when the interventions are implemented. So looking at the process outcomes for the stakeholder engagement, this is helping to co-develop the national and regional representative agricultural pathways. That's one of the outcomes of the stakeholder engagement. It also helps nations create it also helps to inform the national adaptation plans, the NAPs, and the nationally determined contributions. Both of those are part of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement responsibilities for each country and for each one of the parties to that convention. And then it helps to determine intervention priorities at national and regional levels and the coordination of those two scales. And finally, this process, we certainly have the goal to capacity build within countries for these processes, stakeholder engagement, co-generation of scenarios, the data and model, the nuts and bolts of creating the evidence base, and then evaluation of project processes and intervention processes. So that's the orange part of the circle, key part of the framing, iterative stakeholder engagement. Let's turn now to the data and models for integrated assessments. So here, the AgMIP flagship, I guess, or the flag is protocol-based approach, so that we create with all the researchers and stakeholders involved, the integrated modeling framework that includes crops, livestock, whole farming systems, economics, nutrition, and other elements that are important for each country context. And then with this set of data and models, we evaluate pathways and scenarios for future climate, the biophysical and socioeconomic conditions. And we create tools for scaling between regional and national levels. That's a lot of what the current CLARE project is working on. How do you scale between the subnational regions and the national levels? Things like gridded modeling linked to site models, remote sensing, indicators. How can we actually then lift the capability of all countries to develop effective interventions? And then create all of this with the motivation to create the evidence base for adaptation policies, programs, and interventions, so that, again, with the goal of being more effective. Now, the map is showing West Africa. We are going to be hearing from two colleagues, two AgMIP A-team leaders in West Africa and in Southern Africa today in this session. Turning to the diagram, what this is showing is that the integration across scales, which even includes some global scale data in terms of global climate model projections, but that are downscaled to the regions, and some of the economics global data, with things such as prices and productivity and links to global agricultural pathways. But when we go to the regional scale, we go right down to the farming system scale. That's the wonderful diagram, which was created by the daughter of one of our team members in a previous iteration of the project. But from that farming system approach, really this allows us to also, with our data, we look at heterogeneous regions. So it's not just one representative site. We vary across climate, across soils, across economic and poverty level, for example, or number of cattle, or all of this is to describe the heterogeneity in regions in a much more realistic way. Then with the economic model, which is called the trade-off analysis TOA model, developed by John Antle and Roberto Valdivia, then with that model, we then are able to, again, with the A teams, they do intervention testing ex ante beforehand. Well, what about this? What about this set of adaptation packages? You're going to be hearing about more, I'm sure, in the talks to come. And then from this, we get a distributional impact, so that it's not just one, it's the impact on poverty levels across a whole population, farming population of smallholder farmers. And then we can link what we learned at the sub-regional scale, we're working on this right now, to how do we link that up to national scale? How do we then communicate also what we've learned right in the farming system to the national policymakers and global as well? Finally, I won't go through all of these. This is just to really share the communication tool of Impacts Explorer, which please check it out. The website is on the bottom of the slide. And here we encapsulate all the modeling, all the learning from the stakeholder engagement, from the the data and models, scenarios, protocol based, to create the evidence base and present to as wide a group as possible, to all interested. And the Impacts Explorer presents impacts like the climate change projections, the impacts on yields, what's the vulnerability, the climate change impact on net farm income, the vulnerability to climate change in regard to poverty level. And then from this modeling set, and if presented in the Impacts Explorer, the impacts of adaptations on yields, the impacts of adaptations on net farm income, and what are the actual benefits. It's quantifiable from this modeling system, from the integrated modeling system that the A teams create, is benefit of adaptations. Those are our three parts of our framing. You're going to see parts of these in our three presentations just about to begin. This is to invite everyone to who is interested to go to the AgMIP website for the initiatives. This is just one of we're now up to 40 initiatives around the world, to really see what the protocols are all about. All of them are publicly available, up-to-date events, and we hold wonderful, besides this one, like this one, but many others, and news. And also to join AgMIP, it's completely horizontal network, all are welcome. So please go to www.agmip.org to check out more about AgMIP. Now, I'm going to introduce our speakers, but I want to first invite, and I think Eric has put in, Eric Menkos, who is thank you, Eric, for our technical support for organizing the webinar today. I think Eric has put in the chat an invitation to all the participants who are on to introduce themselves in the chat. We always do this in our AgMIP events. So please, I hope you're doing it already, but if you haven't, please so we get a sense, so everyone can get a sense of who's participating and who's being part of this side event, AgMIP side event, and also so we can see who you are, where you're from, and see what countries from the United Nations all around the world. Now, let's turn to our three main presentations. They are, and I'll give their names in a moment, but before that, I want to say, as I said earlier, but I do want to just say these presentations are made, and this entire session is made with great thanks to all the A team members, the base team members who are working on different aspects of those data and modeling that I just presented, and Carolyn Metter, the project leader. So with that, I'm going to introduce first Sabine Homan Kitui. She is from Idrc, Malawi, and she is the lead for the AgMIP A team in Zimbabwe. Thank you, but she's based right now in Malawi. So Sabine, over to you. I'm going to stop sharing. Thank you to all and look forward to the presentations. So what we're going to do is Sabine's going to present. During her presentation, any questions, please put in the question and answer, and immediately following, we'll have Q&A for Sabine and the work in Zimbabwe. So please, after each talk, we'll have Q&A. And then at the end of the session, we'll have general discussion as well. So Sabine, with that, over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Cynthia, and hi, everyone. I see my internet connection is unstable. Perhaps, Eric, you want to share my presentation?
Sure. 1 second.
So here, you would put it on slide mode? On full presentation. Thank you so much. So here, I'm giving you insight for the team in Zimbabwe, who has particularly included ICRISAT, Matopos Research Station, National Lupane State University, the Climate Change Department, Wageningen University, support from Oregon State University. So going back into the last 2 phases of our engagement with AgMIP, and looking in particular at what can we take from this integrated modeling and scenario development to inform farming and food policies in Zimbabwe. Next one. So my contribution is motivated really by the effort of informing policies, actionable decision mechanisms to develop locally adapted solutions for food value chains. To look at the wider impacts of agriculture in food systems, at food and security and nutrition, at health, education, environment, and really third, to look on how can we use the results from this really critical research to engage with stakeholders in this policy dialogue. What are the issues? What does a country like Zimbabwe need? And how can we contribute to make these policies more speaking to the local specific conditions? Because you all know that countries are different, there are different farming systems, and policies are often designed at a national level, running short and really supporting the diversity of countries in response to climate change and other shocks as well. Next. So as Cynthia has introduced, the AgMIP research is in its essence about measuring the impacts of climate change and adaptation and mitigation. So we use this type of research to understand the multidimensional impacts of climate change and shocks using the multi-component impact assessments, using the stakeholder engagement to really interrogate policies and see how they relate, where there are gaps, and working with stakeholders on trying to close these gaps between practice and policies. At a second level, we also use this dialogue to better understand what are the obstacles, why these policies are not being implemented, because through simulation we can show potential, but what is actually then surfacing is often a different level. So we are looking and discussing politics, power structures. We're looking at what programs do we actually miss? Like, how can we better visualize nutrition sensitive agri-food systems? What, for example, should we be doing to look at biomass reserves to mitigate conflicts or to respond to feed shortages? Or how can benefits be shared more equally? And we really, through this engagement, try to change our perceptions, our mindsets, us as researchers and of policymakers and other stakeholders as well, using the medium research visualizations to discuss critically about what needs to be done next. So here, I would like to bring you into the context of Zimbabwe today, especially after not only a perpetuation of economic crisis, we had several drought years, as well as this COVID crisis, which has really pushed people more into poverty. And we know that this year with higher rainfall, the country has made a surplus in grain production. However, there are certain areas in the country which still have a deficit because the policy of agriculture is targeting food security, which is a decision made at the national level. But especially looking at this semi-arid areas, we often fall short in food production, and the potential, we believe, is not being adequately captured. So here, I just wanted to show you the depth in which this kind of food insecurity has been pushed through the COVID crisis as well. Like more than 90% of the households are really facing not only income, but also food security issues. We found 40% of the households are female-headed, which are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate as well as other shocks. And they have been pushing their social networks so much to survive that there is really, I would say, a social fragility that we need to be considering as well when we talk about climate change adaptation. In this context, AgMIP offers methods that can help to strengthen resilience. How can we strengthen resilience at different levels? How can we develop more sustainable mechanisms, including social protection? After such impacts, who needs social protections? How can we bring this in? What services can we develop around food value chains? And then evaluate these type of interventions also in their particular context to, as Cynthia said, lead us further and work with stakeholders. So what next? Next slide. So this, again, because I spoke in the beginning about the multiple dimensions here, just as an appreciation of what does a shock mean in Zimbabwe? It's like 90% of the people complain about a lack of food, a lack of money. 2/3 of the population has been severely disrupted in education, loss of social networks. It goes deeper into more labor burdening, more pushing people into the illegality by breaking COVID rules, by domestic violence, mental health issue, physical health issues. So all these are actions, actors, factors that should be considered when we talk about food systems change and how research can help to move food systems forward. Next one, please. So this is basically the framework on using scenarios with stakeholders to discuss alternative options on how futures might pan out if we do things differently. And the beauty of this RAP approach is really that it's all about agriculture and can consider global influences like represented through this shared socioeconomic pathways and scenarios. We can consider the climate scenarios, and here in particular, we look at the national level. What type of policies are being designed? How do they affect other drivers in the country, like the socioeconomic, technology, biophysical drivers, and then very importantly, at the subnational level. So in each country, we expect to have a series of subnational scenarios because of the differences in farming systems. We here look at one farming system, but actually, we really need to scale this out to see the variety on how national levels policies are being implemented. Also knowing that national policy might face different agroecological contexts, but also having different interests to be implemented in different countries. So there's a whole heterogeneity that we're trying to understand to then find out where the gaps are and what do we need to strengthen to move forward. Next one. So here with stakeholders together, we look at the representative agriculture scenarios as future worlds that could pan out. And when we look at them into the future, we can prepare ourselves towards moving there. And it's not only about having a scenario in future, but it's also understand on how would the way towards that future, how could it look like? And here we have been borrowing from the resilience cup and ball model to visualize that if we continue business as usual in a country like Zimbabwe with weak institutions and policies, we probably end up in a perpetuation of low productivity, low profitability, really not moving out of our challenging situation. Whereas a scenario that stakeholders have developed themselves of sustainable development would mean to altogether invest in supportive institutions and policies that really over time, even though shocks come in, help the systems to move forward and upward. Whereas we have here contrasted this with an unsustainable development an assumption that the future could also pan out that the government and the international world goes towards a protectionist pathway where we invest all in economic growth for short-term benefits, but negative trade-offs in the environment and social issues could take over, so that actually we do not have a long-term positive growth, but a very short-term scenario. Next. And so the approach of these scenarios is that, okay, if these are the future visions, then what type of assumptions can we make on the climate policies? How should they be designed and how would they pan out? And this is all now in a narrative way to not burden you with the details of the simulations, but it's underpinned with results on impacts on poverty, impacts on food security. And for instance, we can say that if there is business as usual, a continuation of limited integration of climate policies in nutrition and food security, agricultural policies, we will perhaps continue to also stumble over climate vulnerability and really affecting economic development. Whereas if we together, like breaking down the walls and work on national frameworks for not only climate, but also nutrition, food security policies in agriculture, we can use the climate resilience and low agricultural pathways to also bring forward nutrition, which is a very critical development issue. As compared to what if under unsustainable development, we ignore climate, we ignore human food and nutrition needs, and we perhaps will be threatened more in a worse scenario by climate impacts. Next one. So talking about what I've been saying before, the RAPs were designed at national level with national level stakeholders saying these are assumptions that the country could take. And we are comparing the national level assumptions with what different farming systems could develop as their future scenarios. And here I'm aligning the three countries, Zimbabwe, Senegal, and Ghana, which all came to similar conclusions that if we continue business as usual and we are not really investing in the economic potential of these countries at the particular farming systems level, we will end up in particular farmings with continuation of poverty because these farming systems are not taken up by their comparative advantages. Whereas if we go green agroecological biodiversity investment, there is a likelihood that we can reduce poverty more effectively, but the insight is that still we face a lot of people living below poverty line. And for us, this was a very critical insight that we cannot just continue making assumptions about market development, about inclusive market development, about agricultural diversification, but we need to look particularly at those remaining poor on how we can create social protection mechanisms that help these people to not fall deeper into destitution as we have seen it now under COVID. And what type of services do we need to create around food value chains so that these people can work and create more income around food value chains, which also make available highly nutritious products locally. So what we are saying here, we are comparing the national level policy with which pans out at the local level to really point out the inconsistency and find mechanisms to address this and to verbalize these inconsistencies. Next one. Here, this is my only slide about the results from simulation outputs, where I just want to show you that, yes, we all know we can simulate and we can simulate that there is potential. We know different crops are differently sensitive to climate change. We see that legumes in particular could make a very strong contribution, but we also see that legumes are not represented in farming systems. They're not even promoted in the current agricultural policies. And so we are using the simulation results to say, yes, we can improve tremendously. We can benefit from better integrated soil crop management, crop diversification, linking crops with livestock and market incentives. And plus, the other added value comes in by reducing the losses, reducing the post-harvest losses, the livestock mortalities, and by improving production and reducing the losses, we can really increase the farm net returns substantially. However, we are asking, why is it not happening? Next slide. And okay, this is one more to highlight. If we apply the simulations say we can halve poverty by investing in diversified, better integrated farming systems. And this graph shows us that green development is sustainable development is more effective in reducing poverty overall than a fast economic growth. But we have these bottom 40% of the population below poverty line, and hence the effort, if we talk national policy, to bring in targeted local specific social protection mechanisms that help addressing these poverty groups. And at the moment, we, as Cynthia said, we are actually revising, we took up another cycle of making our climate change adaptation packages more focusing on extremely poor households. What can be done with these households? This is where we are actually working on. Next one. And this as a wide overview to show how with stakeholder networks, we bring stakeholders from national to local level together to really go through the whole process and say, the country has a vision, how can we achieve this vision? What are the barriers towards it? What does that mean for adaptation planning? And we found it very important that we do not only talk as scientists from our head, but that we sit together and we actually sense, what does it mean if we follow these different pathways? And by engaging in these cup and ball model dynamics, we could really visualize that if we follow business as usual, there was a very strong sense coming out on the left side, this orange graph here, with all the challenges, that the challenges will grow over time and they will derail the system even more from its vision. As in comparison, if we look at these fast economic boom interventions without considering the environment and the social issues, we have quick growth, but it will go down because we will slow down, we cannot hold because of negative externalities. And then it was quite refreshing and uplifting to see how people felt after engaging in a sustainable development pathway, where we would say we move away from the crisis through this sustainable agricultural growth pathway by strengthening the knowledge that we already have and supporting the systems that already exist, but make them sustainable. And we believe that this type of sensing exercises are really critical when we work with stakeholders to motivate and to gain this momentum on where should we be going and what should we be doing. Next. So, sorry for the lot of text. What I would like to summarize here is that we realize after our engagement that research influencing policy is really critical. And we need to make a greater effort, us as scientists, to bring our research really into these country processes that we are part of regular review in their sustainable development agendas and in local climate change adaptation planning. So it takes us a lot of time and effort, but we should be in partnership on policy development processes. And we should also look at the challenging parts in policies, the coping and social protection mechanisms that countries might want to take up for mitigating shocks like COVID impacts and integrating such shocks in their national adaptation planning and NDC, SDC achievement processes. Overall, as Cynthia also has said, we really emphasize the importance of capacity and network building as we engage in these processes, so that we not only to tick off engage in, we have done consultation, but that we really bring in research to understand the local challenges and bring them up into a cross-scale dialogue, including issues that financial inclusiveness, gender inclusiveness. So really a research policy engagement process that helps to support agri-food systems in a sustainable way. Next one. And the stakeholders in Zimbabwe have actually said, okay, if we want to proceed in this direction, then there are 5 things that we need to do. And they are challenging us to say, we need as scientists to build the national capacity in country, so that in-country scientists understand the simulation modeling, so that they can understand and trust these simulations. and use them for their policy processes. At the same time, we need to build the local capacity. We know that the local level solutions are absolutely required, but there is often not enough voice. We know we have this wide UN, other programs, agency implementing programs, they collect a lot of data. So how can we as research networks tap on those data, on this information for them to benefit and the country to benefit? And how can we use all this information to widen this cross-scale dialogue, to bring in more impact evidence also for upscaling, and to also say we need to really work on more long-term processes and partnerships, like especially from a research side, we need to integrate some way or another. And as Cynthia has mentioned, this Impact Explorer is one platform, data platform, where a lot of information could be brought together, stored as a depository, but also where we can see the evolution of long-term collaboration in developing these data platforms. I think with this, I try to keep time. I hope you got an appreciation of the multifaceted of this type of research engagement and policy dialogues that we would like to encourage and take forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sabine. I'm working on, good. I was going to clap. I can't find I want to clap for everybody. Thank you so much for sharing such a thoughtful presentation about the A-team interactions, deep engagement, deep thoughtfulness around these challenges of not only climate change, but sustainable development for smallholder farmers in Zimbabwe. I want to encourage, let's see, I'm just now being able to see chat. Are there any questions by the way, the presentations will be available and the recording, I believe also, if Eric can confirm that in the chat. Are there any questions or comments from any of the 120 participants who are on? Let's see.
So I'm in the Q&A.
Oh, they're in the, oh, good. I'm looking in the chat, but it should be in the Q&A. Okay, thank you very much. All right, I'm going to scan down, and Sabine, if you can stand by. Let's see if there's one specifically. Yes, okay, Michelle Miller is asking, I'm wondering more about how stakeholders are chosen and involved. Are they reimbursed for their participation? Are they representatives of the people who do farm labor, or more representative of owners? So Sabine, if you could, I know this was a very, very active area of work in the project, so maybe you could share how the stakeholders were selected and involved.
So I must say we engage stakeholders based on a common interest to understand the simulations. It's like a capacity development, and it's also an interrogation of policies and engagement processes. So we do not compensate stakeholders for their participation, but we try to work on longer term partnerships with selected representatives from the different government departments, development organizations. At this stage, because we are trying to influence national policies, we have been working more with to set up these processes with the national level representatives. But ultimately, it would be a very important long-term strategy to bring in more farmer representatives, which we have not at this point. Yet we always bring in the representation from particular farming systems like agricultural extension services or NGOs that work in these particular areas to really talk about the sticky issues between the national and the local level.
Wonderful, thank you. I'm just scanning down the chat, and there is a very specific climate question, and I believe Alex Ruane is on, and maybe could type the answer to that about the question about running the guide for running AgMIP climate scenario generation. Alex, if you could Oh, Alex can't see the questions. All right. Maybe Eric, if you could, we'll hook you up. This is a question from Antoine Nguyen in Trinh in Vietnam. So we'll work on making that connection. The next question is, also from Michelle Miller, how is land tenure brought into the modeling and scenario development?
The RAPs as guiding qualitative indicator-based scenarios make certain assumptions about land tenure, which would then be reflected in parameters that are being simulated. So unfortunately, we cannot directly implement, simulate, measure land tenure, but it's like the context given under which we set up certain adaptation packages designed with stakeholders. For example, on a very, you would assume different investment levels and therefore different farm outcomes under private tenureship than communal land tenureship, etc. So there are assumptions that feed into the context in which these model simulations are then.
Wonderful, thank you.
We do also have
I'm
a
going.
few people who are raising hands that we could unmute if you want to do them.
I think given our time, it's 10:48, and Eric, we have until noon, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, I think what we need to do is, I think from the Q&A, I'm going to curate 2 or 3 more questions for Sabine, then ask her to, if you can get to the Q&A to answer by typing. I don't think we're going to be taking live questions right now, but if we have time, I hope we have time after the 2 other presentations that we will then be able to call on people. That's what we'll try to do. But Sabine, just to thanks for the great questions, participants. I'm going to give you 3. I'm going to give you them all at once. And then if you could give some quick answers, and you may want to amplify in the chat. The first one is, let's see. The first one is the adaptation process in Zimbabwe led by local or national government? And how do you engage the private sector? That's one. The second is, Zimbabwe used to be very food secure and exported food to other countries. Sabine, can you shed more light on what the issues are there? And let's see. And then a final one about the RAPs, because the RAPs are really a big part of the AgMIP methodology. To what extent the RAPs are being used or integrated into the climate national policy elaboration? With that, I'll turn to Sabine for some quick answers, further elaboration in chat. And thanks to everyone, including I'll type the answer to how reliable are the simulated results? Very good question from Sandeep Rawal. All right, Sabine, over to you.
Yeah, I would say the Zimbabwe as a country has a national climate change adaptation process and consultative across from the national level down to the different constituencies, including the private sector. So these national processes are ongoing, and we as AgMIP are trying, or our aim is to inform those decision processes about what type of interventions would be applicable and important for what type of farming system, given that the decisions are often made on assumptions that are more developmental, like short-term experience. But in AgMIP, we can really look into the future, and I mean through these simulations, and make assumptions about under such climate these crops would do X, Y, and Z, and so provide a more substantial base for these decisions that are being made. Coming to Zimbabwe as a country, so yes, it was the breadbasket of the Southern Africa, but it is not anymore. There were land tenure change processes, and the country is currently most years food deficient. This year, after 3 or 4 years, I think the only first one, and it has lost a lot of investments in higher value crops. At the moment, it's really very strong on making sure that the basic food security requirements are given. The efforts are there to build it up to a mid-level, what's called mid-income country level. Yeah, the processes, the suggestions are going on. Then what was the next question? I can't hear.
You're muted.
Yep. Let me see if I can remember which one I chose. I think it was at the bottom. Let's see. We did land tenure. And now let's see. Oh, and finally, to what extent are the RAPs actually being integrated now into climate national policy elaboration?
Yeah, so I would say we are in a process. I mean, setting up these RAPs and the simulations, as you may imagine, takes time because all the assumptions, the frameworks need to be really sound. So we cannot say that these have already been incorporated into the national planning processes, but we are on our way to get there. So we are working with stakeholders to prepare the conditions that these can be used. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sabine, and thank you for the great work and your leadership of the great work in Zimbabwe, for the A team and the presentation and the answering the questions. And please continue in the Q&A and chat, somewhere in the chat as well. But let's turn now to our next A team leader. Dilys McCarthy is here from the University of Ghana, and she is the leader of the AgMIP A team in Ghana. Dilys, over to you. If you could, would you like Eric to share screen? Or do you want to share screen? Okay, there you go.
Yeah, so okay, so thank you for the opportunity. So for the introduction, I'm from University of Ghana, and our topic will be on climate change versus food systems, and looking at the case of Navrongo. So by way of background, food insecurity is a topical issue in Sub-Saharan Africa for various very obvious reasons of the numerous constraints that are associated with crop production. And primarily among them is the over-reliance on rain-fed agriculture, poor soil fertility, and low use of external inputs. And apart from these biophysical constraints, there are also a number of other barriers, such as socioeconomic, technological, and institutional ones, which hinder crop production, especially among smallholders, which make up the bulk of crop production. The multifaceted nature of the production constraints therefore calls for an integrated assessment framework that is transdisciplinary. And additionally, there is an increasing demand from stakeholders for data and information products, for tools and other forward-looking assessment frameworks that would enable adequate planning and prioritizing of decision-making process. So for this presentation is going to focus on the crop production component of the food systems and how this is interrelating or will relate with potential impacts of climate change. So we'll look at three different questions to guide this presentation. So the first will be the sensitivity of current agricultural production systems to climate change, meaning we are maintaining the current production systems as they exist. Then we have what the impact of climate change will be on future agricultural production systems. So this is where the RAPs that were spoken about by Cynthia and Sabine would come in. So in a future production systems where we have the socioeconomic, technological, and other institutional factors changing, how would climate change impact be? And then finally, to look at the benefits of climate change adaptation. So this is quite a heavily loaded slide, but this is just to give an indication of how the framework for the regional integrated assessments looks like. So we have issues, components with climate data, just looking at the GCMs, the crop models, livestock models, and socioeconomic models, which are used to assess climate change risk or impacts. And then we follow up with engagement process with stakeholders. And then this helps to inform co-designing of defined agricultural production systems or scenarios, taking into consideration the biophysical, socioeconomic, and then the technological factors. And this is done with the help of experts, review of documents, that are strategic documents, and then receiving feedback from stakeholders. And this helps in redesigning of farming systems. And this are then further evaluated. The impact of the co-design systems are looked at, and these are then further referred to policymakers for further discussion. So it's a whole iterative process, as has been indicated, and the entire process is heavily reliant on engagement with stakeholders. So to give a little more details in terms of how we came about by the various scenarios. So in the case of Ghana, we started with a process of characterizing or reviewing the various strategic documents that are relevant in the agricultural sector, and also developing our RAPS narrative based on what we found from this. And then this was shared with selected stakeholders that are working closely in this area to share their feedback for further work. And then we had a close network of stakeholder engagement where this RAP narratives, so basically there were 3 RAPs, the Sustainable Development Pathway, the Business as Usual Development Pathway, and then the Fossil Forward-Driven Development Pathway. And this were then reviewed by stakeholders. And finally, we went into another workshop where this final products were further reviewed and then fed into our socioeconomic modeling framework for assessments to be made. So this slide shows us just a selected number of variables that were used in the analysis of the impact of climate change on future agricultural production systems. So we have four categories: the institutional and policy, the socioeconomic, the technological, and then the various variables. So for instance, if you take fertilizer prices under Sustainable Development Pathway, what would be the change in direction and what would be the magnitude of change for fertilizer prices? So this were the exercises that we went through with a number of stakeholder engagements to be able to come up with. To give a little bit of background of the study area, which is Navrongo. So this is the farming system is basically legume cereal based, and it, of course, low input, as I indicated earlier, and it is unimodal. It has a unimodal rainfall pattern, and livestock is a very important component of the farming system. And soil fertility is an issue. The soils are shallow, and productivity, of course, then is low. So if you look at the climate of the projected climate for Navrongo, for instance, the projection is about 2050. Whether the climate is likely to be more variable and would be more wetter in the future with higher temperatures associated with it. So I must say here that when we talk about increased temperature, rainfall or weather, we are only talking about the amount of rainfall and not necessarily the distribution, because currently the amount of rainfall that is received in this region is more than what is required for crop production. But then the problem has to do with the in-season or within-season distribution. So I want to share some of the results to some of the questions that I posed. So this one has to do with the sensitivity of current production systems to climate change. And so we have the first graph, which is for maize, and we have for two different emission scenarios. So we have the RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5. So for maize, you see decline in yield. And of course, the higher emission scenario has a higher yield reduction. And I must indicate that each of those boxes is made up of 5 GCMs. So the box plot here represents 5 GCMs. And if you compare the effect, the climate change impact on maize to sorghum, it is clear that sorghum is relatively less negatively impacted by climate change, of course, due to its higher tolerance to heat and drought stress. And for peanuts, unlike the cereals, benefits from climate change mainly due to the carbon dioxide fertilization that it benefits from. And when this are fed into our socioeconomic model, we see that more than 50% of our households or the households remain vulnerable to climate change. So here, let me indicate that we work with about 200 households. So if we're talking about 50%, so we are looking at about 100 out of the 200 households that we worked with, we're vulnerable to climate change. And the results also indicated that between 5 to 7% loss in net farm returns and an average increase of between 4 to 5% in poverty. One would have expected that the impact would have been more negative than what is presented, but it is mainly because of the peanut effect and also because the proportion of land which is put under peanuts is higher than the cereals put together. So that has a very important role to play here. So here we move to what the impact of climate change would be on future agricultural production systems. One thing which is evident is the magnitude of change that is seen for particularly the cereals. So we have higher decline in yield under the more intensified production systems, which characterize our future production systems. And for here, we are showing only 2 scenarios, that's the sustainable development and then the fossil fuel driven scenarios. So we see that the fossil fuel driven scenarios always have relatively higher impact, that's negative impact compared to the sustainable development scenarios. And here, at least 40 to 45, so that's 40 for the sustainable development and 45 for the fossil fuel driven development scenarios. We have between 40 for the sustainable development and 45 for the fossil fuel driven scenario cases, where we have 40% of, so 40% of households under the sustainable development, 45% of households under the fossil fuel driven scenarios that are vulnerable to climate change. And in terms of the net farm returns, we have between 5 to 10% increase in net farm returns and an average decline in poverty of between 5 to 10%. And I must indicate again here that one of the main component or the contribution factors to this is also because of the changes in the socioeconomic parameters that came along with the RAPs. So for instance, the household sizes were big. The land size, the average land sizes were also small. But with the projections of increasing in land size and reduction in household size, this all fed into the outcome that we see. So what are the benefits of adaptation? So we looked at just one, presenting just for one adaptation that we looked at, which is the use of heat tolerant variety. And one thing which is clear is that the crops vary in terms of their response to the heat tolerance use because of the differences in their physiology in their physiology and what they need. And at least 50% of the households adopt the use of heat tolerance variety, resulting in an increase in the net farm returns by on average of about 16%, and with a subsequent decline in poverty by 22 and 26%. So 22% for the sustainable development pathway, and then 26 for the fossil fuel driven scenario. To share a few of feedback from some of our stakeholder engagement processes, it came out that the AgMIP CLARE regional integrated assessment tools were seen as a type of assessment that the NAPS process requires to carry out vulnerability assessments and also determine the economic feasibility of the various adaptation strategies that they currently have. There is also the request for capacity building in modeling for stakeholders, looking both at the policymakers as well as the local scientists, so as to, among other things, be able to appreciate better model outcomes and also be able to extend the use of the methodology. And one interesting thing was also the request for the final outputs to be published on the portals of the Environmental Protection Agency, which is the National Communicating Unit on climate change related processes. And also stakeholders requested for the scaling up of the methodology to other major farming systems within the country, so as also to be able to capture some of the very important commercial crops. And a number of entry points for AgMIP CLARE outputs were also identified and enumerated. Just to state a few, there was the talk of widening the stakeholders and then the community engagement processes on the methodology as well as its findings. There was also the request for more to focus more on the strategic and policy documents, since they provide sort of a guidance for some of these processes. And also the mention of a high-level engagement to create awareness among policymakers, such as our Parliamentary Select Committee on Environment. So this is just a picture of one of our workshop stakeholder engagement activity that was carried out. And out of that, a number of adaptation strategies were shortlisted by the stakeholders, which I just want to share. So the first one was the provision of small dugouts for off-season farming. As I indicated, this is an area with a unimodal rainfall pattern. So for more than 6 months, it is dry and no real farming activity is ongoing. So it is seen as a possible adaptation to enhance food production. The development and promotion of improved crop varieties. Maybe an example is what we have already shown with the heat tolerant variety. And then the provision of credit facilities, especially to women, to engage in petty trading as alternate livelihood engagement. And the final one, which is a bit more controversial, is the development of community wood lots for charcoal burning, also seen as an alternate livelihood. But so it will be an interesting thing to look at what maybe setting up community wood lots in itself would help in terms of its contribution to efforts at combating climate change vis-a-vis burning of the wood lot for the purpose of charcoal production. So I'll end this presentation with a statement that I picked from one of the stakeholder workshop, which was to the effect that the regional integrated assessment framework of AgMIP is comprehensive. It's a comprehensive methodology to provide evidence-based research outputs to support the adaptation plans at the country level. Thank you.
Thank you, Dilys. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. I believe there are some questions for you. I've been looking at the Q&A. There may be some in the chat as well. So if you could now, I think, stop sharing your screen, and if it's possible to turn on your video, then maybe I'll direct some questions to you, if that could work. Yes, yeah. Wonderful. So the first Q&A that from the Q&A that I'd like to share with you, let's see, is this one. Farmers are important stakeholders. This is from Swati Hazra. Farmers are important stakeholders in agriculture. How does AgMIP A team, how do the AgMIP A teams reach them? So I think you have some experience in Ghana with interaction with farmers. So perhaps you could share your experience.
Okay, so in the very first phase of AgMIP, we had a number of engagements at the local level, at the regional level, and we had a number of farmer representation. So they are very much engaged in the process, and also representation through the extension agents as well as the NGOs that work with farmers. So their views are captured. And for instance, in the first phase, recall we worked on maize, maize, millet, and peanuts. And the feedback from the farmers was that sorghum was more important to them than maize, than millet in that particular environment. So based on that feedback, we had to bring on board sorghum. So the engagement also includes farmers to some extent.
Wonderful. Thank you. Zina Bird is asking, this is following on from this, testing on other crops. So I believe you went on to not just do maize, but you have tested peanut and other crops, right?
Yeah. Yeah, so we have maize, sorghum, and peanuts. And we could have done more, but it was also an issue of capacity and time that we're working with. So we limited it to the 3 crops, which were maize, peanuts, and sorghum. And we're also classified as the most important.
Wonderful. Then following on from that, Michelle Miller asks about the market structure of sorghum, maize, and peanut. And I know this was something very much that was part of the discussion of the economic modeling in the project. Are there companies that purchase those different crops, or what is the use of those crops? What are the supply chains, or short or long? What is the market concentration for peanut and sorghum as well as maize? And are there private companies that are locally owned, independent? Are they associated? Is there also linkages to the transnational companies as well, for example, with peanut?
Okay, so my response, okay, I'll try to answer this, even though this is not my area. But basically, these are smallholder farmers. So it is mainly for subsistence, and then the surpluses are sold out. Maize is the main cash crop among the three crops that, of course, okay, so between maize and sorghum, maize is more of a cash crop. The sorghum has several other uses for brewing of local alcohol, for some special traditional diets, and many other things. So that's the extent to which, but for peanuts, it is usually sold. In terms of the market structures, that I would say is not very well developed, at least within that area.
Wonderful. I'm going to ask one more. I'm not sure whether I can't find it now again on the chat. Maybe, oh, this might have in the Q&A, this might have been in the chat. But how do you go about the process of developing the adaptation packages? And I just saw it was great because then the stakeholders were also proposing further adaptation packages. But perhaps could you just share a bit more about the process of developing the adaptation packages?
Okay, so we go to, during our stakeholder engagement, we try to talk about what they see as the effect of climate change within their systems, what they think are causing the reduction in yield, etc. And for instance, what informed what we used was the emphasis on the heat, the temperature effects. So then the issue was like, if there are crops that can sustain the heat, then they will be able to reduce the level of yield loss. And that was what informed working on the heat tolerant variety, for instance. There were a number of other things that stakeholders mentioned, but a number of them were not things that were feasible within the time frame of the project. So those ones we could not work on. So it's a process of dialogue between the stakeholders and then the scientists on what is needed and what is possible within the time frame and what could be done maybe much later.
Wonderful. Dilys, thank you so much. I think we'll turn now to our third and final speaker. But thanks so much for your insights and for your leadership of the Ghana A team as part of AgMIP. Let's turn to our third speaker, who is Laura Tal. She is at IPAR in Senegal, and she leads the AgMIP A team in Senegal. Laura, over to you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Cynthia. Let me just start sharing the screen.
Good. Okay. Yes, if you can make it to presentation mode, that would be great.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay.
Beautiful.
Okay. So it's a little bit difficult to present after three beautiful speakers like you are. So I will focus more my presentation on stakeholder engagement and focus on the work that has been undertaken by the Senegal team in Senegal. Okay. So as you may have seen with the other presenter, AgMIP has a lot of objectives and goals. And for this presentation, I will focus on one of these goals, which is influence climate policy decision making and actions. How do we do that? There's a numerous way of trying to influence climate policy. Within the AgMIP framework, we want to identify gaps, needs, and opportunities to link science to policy. We try to provide stakeholders with actionable information to improve agricultural system resilience. And we develop for that information and decision support tool like the Impact Explorer that was presented earlier by Cynthia. In Senegal, there are some examples of planification processes that are successfully implementing adaptation to climate change into their policy. We can cite, for example, the Integrated Water Management Plan for Senegal, 2018 to 2030, and some local development plan for municipality. But what we have realized is that there's really a lack of planning for adaptation in the agricultural sector. So one of our questions was to mainstream the adaptation into policy. There is a lot of strengths and assets in Senegal to succeed in mainstreaming adaptation to climate change into policy. First one, there's a strong commitment and political will of the sector. But what is the sector? Is it agriculture? Is it environment? Is it water and sanitation? When we talk about something very transverse, cross-cutting like climate change and adaptation, it is very difficult to define the sector and the stakeholders that needs to be involved. Some tools exist. You have had the presentation of the tools developed by AgMIP, but many other teams are developing tools for climate change adaptation. In Senegal, there has been a lot of studies on vulnerability in the agricultural sectors. There is also some research on this adaptation, crop-wise at the farm level, but also at the landscape level. There is some expertise in the country, and there's also some financing available for this integration process. But constraints are also present. In fact, how do we ensure that climate change is not just a couple of words that are displayed in the policy documents? Who is in charge when we address this cross-cutting problematic like adaptation to climate change? And how do we foster, encourage sharing and dialogue between policymakers and researchers? And we know that this dialogue can happen, but most of the time we don't really listen to each other or understand each other. In the AgMIP team, our approach to engage stakeholders for mainstreaming of adaptation of agriculture to climate change into policies has been, to my understanding, quite innovative. We work with the stakeholder to build scenarios of future agriculture at different scale, local scale, national scale. As was already presented by Sabine, we realized different scenarios, and the scenarios didn't come up from one scientist's mind or a couple of scientists in a lab or in a meeting room. These scenarios are the results of an iterative process with expert consultation, stakeholder sharing, and many workshops, and also a thorough review of the information, literature, science available. So in Senegal, we came up with three scenarios, and the scenarios are quite the same within the three countries, except for the content. We have a business as usual scenario, sustainable development, and a non-sustainable development scenario. in Senegal, for example, for the sustainable development scenario, the stakeholders had really put the focus on the agroecological transition. There is a really strong political and movement right now in Senegal for this transition. So we couldn't go by this, so it was included in the scenario. Within the unsustainable development, we also put into focus the reliance to fossil fuel, but also the fact that Senegal is now producing gas, which is quite new. It happened in the last two years. So we try to integrate the main interest, the policies ongoing in the country into our scenarios. Okay. It's not only about the policy, the policy. We also try to evaluate climate impact, but also the different climate policy assumptions. We have, for example, in the sustainable development scenario, a strong lead for improved food and nutritional security based on this agroecological transition. These different scenarios were presented to stakeholders in many more details than what I've done in this last minute. So we tried with them to look to have a really quick analysis of these scenarios and also of different other products that have been provided by the AgMIP team to see if they were able to close the gap between science and policy. And we came up with some strengths: robustness of the AgMIP methodology, the need expressed by policymakers for this type of evidence, and also the fact that the evidence provided by AgMIP were adapted to the context. But there were also some weaknesses. For example, some stakeholders thought that the AgMIP presentation or the AgMIP products were too technical. We presented the local results, but it was only for one region in Senegal. And they felt that some important socioeconomic indicators were missing. But what is important is that even with this weakness, there's a lot of opportunities. As I was saying in the beginning, we see in Senegal and in West Africa, in Africa maybe in general, a strong political will for national adaptation. All over West Africa, we have this ongoing meetings, discussion, fundings for the planning of national adaptation. So funds are really available to support research if we express correctly the need for research. But there's also some challenges. How do we communicate better? How do we scale up our findings? And how do we make possible for researchers at the national or local level? How do we make them the actors of the research and not having only researchers from outside of the country coming and being the expert of this type of question? So one thing is clear for sure. There is a demand from stakeholders for impact assessment data, for information as provided by the AgMIP team. And discussions are really moving forward on how we will close this gap. Some tools are available. Researchers are really trying to reach out, and community practitioners, for example, are created. In Senegal, we have the Ministry of Environment, who has asked for the organization of a community of practitioners, because they really sense the need for this type of space for discussion and sharing. Working with the AgMIP team, we realized that this approach with the representative agricultural pathway mixed with other tools, the back and forth, very iterative process of stakeholder workshop, the working groups. Even though we are in COVID mode, we are having really regular meetings within the researchers community. The consortium is very strong, over 1,000 researchers, and after 10 years, they are still working together. And also this really powerful tool that is Impact Explorer. So I really encourage you to go and look at this at the website to see the powerfulness of this tool. So using this approach, using these different tools, using the inner strength of the AgMIP consortium, I think that it was possible to a certain extent to bring science and policy together on the Senegalese landscape. We are trying to create a synergy among development actors while meeting expectation of policymakers, which is really not very easy. I didn't really present myself. I work in a little think tank in West Africa, but based in Senegal. And with the support of the AgMIP team, which we are members of, we were able to help the Senegalese delegation for the COP as scientific advisor, and we are still doing so. We were also identified to provide data for the national adaptation plan processes, and these were data from the AgMIP project. So these data are used actually in the national adaptation plan of Senegal. And we are also the one animating the community of practitioners on climate change that has been asked from the Ministry of Environment of Senegal. I will not come back in great detail on this, but for us it's quite a success, because for one time, this is the government asking for researchers to get together and share their science with them, and not the contrary, because most of the time we have the feeling that it's for the scientists to craft their science, to make it available to decision maker and to policy maker. But this time, this is the opposite. It is the government that are really willing to have this space of discussion with practitioners and scientists. But as you can see on this slide, this is not, these things didn't happen overnight. This is quite a long process, started in 2015, I think, or 2012. So this leads me to some of the lessons that were learned by the A-Team Senegal of AgMIP. What we've learned working on adaptation to climate change with the AgMIP team is that we really have to identify the needs from the decision makers and not just come with an idea of what they need or what they want. So we really need to have a dialogue, constant dialogue and fluid dialogue with decision makers. This process really needs to be participatory, forward-looking, and iterative. To make this process fruitful and interesting for the decision makers, we need to have a strong research with involvement of, as I was saying, of local researchers. So to do so, we need capacity building of this local research team, but also capacity building of stakeholders. Some stakeholders were saying, yeah, you are doing really wonderful things, but they are quite technical and difficult to get. We cannot simplify all the science, so sometimes we need to build the capacity of the stakeholders to make them able to understand some of this science. In Senegal, the AgMIP team really put their trust on our think tank. So I think that sometimes the implication of a broker or of a middleman between the policy maker and the scientific hard science scientist can be interesting to help build and animate this dialogue. And last but not least, we need a long-term engagement of the research team with decision makers. Divis was saying earlier, yes, some of the adaptation package could not be tested because the time frame of the project was too short. When we talk about adaptation to climate change, we really need time. We cannot do everything on a 2 year, 3 years project. And that's what is quite interesting with the AgMIP team, because it is encompassing project time. We are still working together, even though projects are not ongoing, or we are always looking for other fundings. So I am quite new to this consortium, the AgMIP consortium, and I really enjoy being part of this team. So I wanted to say that before the end of my presentation. So this is all for me, and thank you. Merci beaucoup. Sorry for my broken English, and over to you, Cynthia.
Merci beaucoup, Laure. It was wonderful, wonderful presentation. So wonderful to be able, I feel we have time to go in depth in each one of these 3 geographies. So thank you so much for sharing the insights from the A team in Senegal. Let's see, are there any specific questions for Laure? We could take 1 or 2. And then we will have a bit of time for some general discussion as well. And we have a couple of people who have their hands up. We would ask them for a short question or intervention. But let's just see if there are questions in particular for Laure. Let's see. I think maybe we can ask Laure for, this is from Sadnam Pour Shirazi, and I might be paraphrasing this. It's really following on, Laure, what you were just saying about how it's a process, really a long-term process for the scientists and the researchers of a country to interact with the policymakers. And I'd like to ask you, in Senegal, are there some strategies being implemented already, and are these being evaluated? The question is, how do we go? Is there sort of next steps for really carrying this all the way to the implementation phase? And do we need, and Shabnam is asking, do we need special teams to be formed for this, for the implementation? What are your thoughts on that?
This is quite a difficult question. From my experience, there is some adaptation implemented into policies. And there are some policies that are actually implemented in the real life of people. but we are facing in our African country a lack of evaluation of policies. So we don't know how well they are implemented, and we don't know what their impact are. So I am really sorry, I cannot answer more clearly.
That's wonderful. I think, in fact, that is very much right on in response. Clearly, as some implementations have already begun, of course, in many countries around the world, in most countries. But what Laura, I think, is really bringing forward that's so critical, and this is something that AgMIP, I think, could very much contribute to, is developing policy evaluation teams, adding that expertise to the AgMIP team approach. Good. All right. Let's see if there's anything else are there any other questions specifically for law? I actually don't see any. Let's see. Let me just check the chat as well. But I think not. Okay, so what I think we're going to do, thank you to Laura. And if all of the speakers could turn on their video, if it's possible, so that then everyone will be able to see, correct? And we have two hands raised. We don't know that some have been on for a while, but we have Samba Fall. Could you turn on your, unmute and make a short question, pose a short question or a short intervention? Samba, over to you.
Okay, so thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for giving me the floor. But I think that you are hearing me very well. And
yes.
By the way, I also thank Lord for his very good presentation. But also my question have already been answered by Sabine. It was about how extent the RAP are being used for the national climate processes. So I think that is already been answered. But let me also seize this opportunity to also to have a quick dialogue with Lord. I think that Lord have been mentioning that it would be very nice or important to have a broker between policymaker and also research communities. So, and I think that I'm from an NGO who are working on setting up enabling framework to facilitate this process. So, and I would be very keen to work again with IPAR about this process and to see how we can facilitate the enabling framework so that policymakers, communities, and also research institutions can work together from the planning processes up to the evaluation stages.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you, Samba. Laura, to you. I think that was addressed to you.
Yes, I know Samba, and he was just stressing the fact that when the dialogue is not easy, maybe we can add a third part to ease up the dialogue, and I think that's one of the things that many NGOs and research institutions are already doing, and this role needs to be put forward. We sometimes need broker or middleman to make things easier for researchers and policymakers. Thank you.
Mute. Wonderful. Let's turn to our second hand that is raised. We'll see that maybe also for a long time. Omari Mizrai, are you still here? Good. Please pose your question to one or all of the speakers, but shortly, or a short intervention. Thank you very much. you're on mute. Can you unmute yourself, please?
Yeah.
We heard you momentarily. See if you can unmute, please.
I am trying to unmute and do you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. For all presenters, actually, I have learned a lot on how to integrate policy and research. And for Senegal team, I know there was another mechanism for climate financing, and this improvised climate finance mechanism, which was developed by technical support from IID. And I think that also can lead us to think of more on how this mechanism can be also integrated on the AgMIP tools, because it helps channel funding to the lower local level government, where climate adaptation is being carried out. So I think I'll a little bit back to AgMIP again. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your intervention. Was it addressed to Laura, I think? I'm not sure. Omari, could you repeat, please, just the gist of your question?
Yeah, my question is, in Senegal, do they have any linkage with this improvised climate finance mechanism, which was developed by Senegalese team with the IID?
Oh, wonderful. Okay, we got the question. Are you familiar with that, with the answer to that, about the links to the climate finance mechanism that was developed with IIED?
Yes, I'm part of the Tanzanian team which is working on the DCF projects.
Wonderful. I hope we could join up the efforts.
And recently, actually, we are looking forward to join Life AR, which is also a big funding mechanism that needs to be integrated into local development plan. Because if these things are not integrated into local development plan, it is difficult to implement, because climate action really needs to be done at the lower level where impact can be seen. And the DCF mechanism, actually, it is basically 4 components. One is funding. We need funds to channel down to the lower level of government. And then we need to have institutions that will really work on the lower level government. That is a representative of the local community that can assist in planning. And then we need to have planning tools. And AgMIP is also because that is a high level where you download maybe climate information, model them, do economic modeling, do crop modeling. That could also assist then the policy communities to believe that this is working. And we have also planning tools, but the end of it that you need to do monitoring, evaluation, and learning. Because because learning, monitoring, evaluation, which is done at local level, but again, with some institution at the district level. So there, they see achievement, and it is possible now to do climate action at the level. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Omari, very much for elaborating. Laura, could you give a brief response? This is about the climate finance and the parts and the pieces that go into that. If you could just give a brief response, and also perhaps get together following this this session to see how AgMIP could participate in that program. Laura.
Yeah, I will give a quick answer. There are some climate funds available in Senegal, like the one you are talking about. But as you were saying, they are quite complex to get, and most of the time you need to be a really big organization with a lot of consultants to help you write those demands. So this is quite difficult for local governments to get this money. And in our different stakeholders meeting, it was always coming up. How do we get to these fundings? They are here, they are available supposedly, but we don't know how to write the good enough demands to get this finance. So this is quite an issue, and I think that some colleagues are working on it. Is it okay, Omari?
It's okay, but actually, you know, it has been we have low capacity of getting that fund because basically most of our several countries we are looking for taxation more than mitigation.
Yes,
and
exactly.
Yeah.
To realize that.
Yes. You know, I'm just thinking that as we go forward, because we're almost ready to wrap up our session. But this is another area that, just as we said, the policy evaluation program, policy and program evaluation could be a new area for AgMIP A teams to include. Developing the capacity to help to provide some of the technical work that is put into the request for international funding. This is something definitely that AgMIP can help on, because our group, you know, has helped many countries and many teams do this. We're doing this, for example, right now. We've done it in Uzbekistan, and we're working, yes, in RLC region, Afghanistan, some of that very deep technical work, which AgMIP is really providing, you know, I mean, as we work together, we're developing that capacity. So, but that could be an explicit goal for the next round of AgMIP. So thank you, Amari, very much for raising those challenges around the application for international climate financing. With that, thank you to everyone who have put all the great questions in the chat. We're trying to, and Alex has a note, also worth noting that our global modeling efforts, Alex, want to join? Can you turn on your mic and you say your comment?
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to know, we've been talking in this project or in this presentation today in particular about the way we bring our AgMIP resources to bear on regional problems and national level problems. But of course, we have within AgMIP efforts to combine our regional approaches with global approaches that provide a starting point for biophysical and economic outlooks all around the world. And that gives us unique perspectives on things like competitive balance and vulnerability hotspots, and the types of systems that may be better or worse suited for future outcomes, whether it's the climate or other development outcomes. So yeah, we're kind of ready to get started anywhere in the world. Thanks.
Thanks, Alex. Just wanted to introduce Alex, who is the science coordinator for AgMIP. Thanks, Alex, for those comments. And so all participants, please, whoever would like to join AgMIP, there's been that question in the chat. So in order to join AgMIP, what it means is you join the AgMIP listserv, then you're part of AgMIP. So if you go to the agmip.org website, there's a place where you can join. If you would like to send us an email, that's the email address is info@agmip.org. And so with any kind of specific questions. Also, please follow up with the presenters with their, I think Dilys put her email in the chat. Laura and Sabine, if you're okay, or maybe you've done so already, if you could put your email as well. There were wonderful questions raised in the chat. We tried to answer as many as possible, but please follow up with more questions. There were wonderful questions about AgMIP, how AgMIP works, the reliability, how we work to emphasize, to build the reliability of the models, how to deal with like nitty-gritty things like CO2 effects, but also then very deep questions about the social and economic aspects and policy aspects. And that's what AgMIP really is about. It's joining all of these up in an interdisciplinary way so that that we can all learn together as we go forward. So I'd like to turn to each one of our three presenters for a final thought of 1 minute each, and then we'll sign off. And we're going to go in reverse order. So Laura, over to you, just your sign off for this wonderful session today. And thank you so much for being part of it.
Thank you, Cynthia. I would just say that I was impressed by the number of participants. There is so many webinars, activities going on around the UN Summit for Food System. So I am really grateful to the participants. And thank you all for inviting me at this talk. Thank you.
Wonderful. Oh, yes. So Alex is just saying the participants can't see the numbers. So there were over 120 that participated in this UNFSS session. Dilys, over to you for your final thought and sign off. Wait, be sure you're on mute. Unmute, please.
Yeah, so also I want to say thank you for the opportunity to share some of our results, and also interesting for in terms to see the interest from the participants. So we hope to have more of this in the future. Thank you.
Wonderful, Dilys. Yes, we do. As Laura was emphasizing, and I think what it shows is this, responding to climate change is a long-term challenge, and forming relationships for working together is a key part of it. And that is really very much a main part of AgMIP community, as we often call AgMIP a community of science. And Sabine, over to you for your final thought.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. I really enjoyed learning again from each other, from our teams, because always, I mean, we can't meet, but there's always so many sparks that we can pick from each other to go forward. And then from this rich feedback from participants, I think this is really a good technical innovation to bring us all together and work on this continuity. Yeah, thank you so much.
Wonderful, Sabine, Laura, and Dilys. I have to say, I like our all-women session for presenters, but we very much also acknowledge, as we did several times, all of the AgMIP teams of all and participants, the members of the teams of the A teams, the base teams, Carolyn Mutter, the project leader of all genders who work together. So we look forward to continuing our interactions, and we were just very, very proud and honored to be part of the UN Food Systems Summit Science Days. So all the best to all participants, and to be continued. We hope to continue the interaction. Bye.